Hello and welcome to today's video. It is the last video in the homeostasis series and it is on osmoregulation. We've been saying for the last few videos that homeostasis comes from the Greek word which means same and steady, and it refers to any process that living things use to actively maintain fairly stable conditions that are necessary for survival. So let's get into it. The learning goals for today are, firstly, to identify and explain the various homeostatic mechanisms that maintain water balance in animals. There's two categories. We're going to look at osmoregulators and osmoconformers. In terms of, similar to last week, structural features, we'll talk about behavioral responses, that is choices that organisms make to maintain, in this case, their water levels. We'll look at physiological mechanisms, so things that happen inside the organism, but this time they're not by choice. It's because of physiology. We'll look at homeostatic mechanisms, so this refers to like the hormonal responses and that. And we'll also identify and explain the various mechanisms that plants use in similar ways, obviously not behavioral responses, but we'll still look at structural features and homeostatic mechanisms. So you can pause the video here and just write some kind of version of these learning goals. Okay, let's get into it. So, osmoregulators and osmoconformers. Before we get into the big topics of this video, it might be helpful just to jump back a bit and get a wider view on everything that we're talking about. So, osmo comes from the word osmosis, and you would remember that osmosis refers to the movement of water molecules, specifically across a semi-permeable membrane from a region of, it's what's called a low solute concentration to a region of a high solute concentration. So that means like where there's not much water, but there's high salts, that water will move into that region to bring like an equal concentration. So a helpful diagram that might show this is this. It's a U-tube, and it's the classic U-tube experiments, and you can see that there's larger molecules and they are in water. So these larger molecules could be something like salt particles or sugars. And the water in this case, and water is called a universal solvent. It's what other things dissolve in. The larger particles are not the solvent, that's the water, so they are called the solutes. So in this experiment we have, let's call them sugars, the larger molecules. We can see that they can't pass through the semi-permeable membrane. They can't reach that equilibrium that they want to. So what's going to move to reach equilibrium? It will be the water. The water can pass through, and so it will pass through until the concentration of solute to solvent is the same on both sides. So a higher solute concentration means there's less free water molecules. And a higher, whatever it is, higher salt concentration or higher sugar concentration. And osmosis is essentially the diffusion of these free water molecules, and they move from where there's a low solute concentration, hopefully this makes more sense, now to an area of a high solute concentration. Organisms are continually producing metabolic wastes. So when metabolism occurs, that's the processes that sustain life. We have these nitrogenous waste compounds that are building up. And they are extremely toxic to the body if we don't expel them. And so we dilute them in mammals in the form of urea with the output of water. And we also have this input of water. We constantly need to be drinking to make up for that loss of water through urination or even through like evaporation, sweating. So in other words, this is constant input and output. So it's important that we keep our water levels in check. Let's look at why. Say if you took a red blood cell and you had it sit in different types of solutions. In the isotonic solution, it's awesome. They're happy. Water just freely flows into the cell across that membrane and out of the cell, and it's just this nice even concentration. But if we place that same red blood cell into what's called a hypertonic solution, then the cell will actually lose its water because it's extremely salty, say outside of the cell. And so that water is going to move outside of the cell to try to dilute that salty concentration outside. And so what's going to happen to the cell? Well, it's going to shrivel, and that's called plasmolysis. Equally as detrimental is if the cell is more salty on the inside, where it's got a high solute concentration. Well, that water is going to move from where it's not so salty, where it's a low solute concentration, so that's outside the cell, it's going to move inside the cell. And so the cell is going to swell, and it can actually burst or lyse. And so that's why isotonic solution drinks are really good, as can be marketed in the athletics world. So depending on the environment, organisms have different mechanisms for maintaining water balance. And there's these two broad categories that we can group organisms into based on how they do this. So all animals, mammals, humans, are either called osmoregulators or osmoconformers. And even those words suggest how they kind of do this. So an osmoconformer, like this octopus, it has the same osmolarity on the outside as they do on the inside. Osmolarity means this, it refers to the concentration of salt to water. So it has the same concentration of salt to water, both inside the octopus, as it does to the outside water environment. This is nice as they don't have to spend heaps of energy on regulating their internal osmotic environment. But the downside is, if the environment changes, so does their internal environment. And so this can cause big swings. So a lot of organisms are instead osmoregulators, including us, including the brine shrimp. It lives in salt water, and they have to regulate the amount of water inside of them. If the saltiness outside changes, it doesn't matter. That takes a lot of energy, and in fact about 30% of their metabolism goes to regulating this. So this whole kind of process of osmoregulation we're going to look at really soon. But for now, I'm going to move on. That was the introduction. So let's look at water balance in animals. So the learning goal was to look at structural features. We're going to talk about the excretory system, behavioral responses, physiological mechanisms, as well as homeostatic mechanisms. We'll talk about ADH and the kidney. So starting off with structural, that is physical features. Since dehydration is a major problem for land animals in regulating water and osmolarity levels, animals have various features to help them, including structural outward physical features, behavioral responses, and physiological and homeostatic mechanisms. So let's just focus on structural. We have in animals scales, feathers. Humans have skin to help us retain water. Even hair and skin on mammals contains keratin, and keratin waterproofs the surface and prevents dehydration, as it minimizes evaporation. Then we have the kidney. Which are essential organisms in maintaining a constant internal environment by filtering waste products from the blood and excreting them in the form of urea in mammals. We need the kidney because of that buildup of nitrogenous waste, which we said is really toxic and will eventually poison a cell by affecting the pH severely. So we dilute it and expel it in the form of urea. The main functional unit of the kidney, so in mammals, is the nephron. So remember that the nephron has this particular part, and it is responsible for the reabsorption of water. Can you remember what part of the nephron that is? Well, it's the loop of Henle, because if water isn't reabsorbed, the water is therefore expelled from the nephron, which eventually connects to the collecting duct, which eventually connects to the bladder, and then is expelled out through the urethra. So it's not surprising that different organisms have different length loops of Henle's. We see organisms that live in very hot environments with much longer lengths because they need to reabsorb as much water as they can. They don't want to lose it. But then we have other organisms like fish, which live in obviously aquatic environments, so they don't need to have such a long loop of Henle. They don't have to worry about this. So these are a few examples of structural features. We have scales, feathers, and loops of Henle's. But we could also talk about behavioral responses. So this refers to behaviors involved in maintaining adequate water levels. We have the desert frog, and it's quite swollen and plump and moist looking for a frog in the desert. And that's because it conserves so much water because it doesn't want to lose it in the form of urine. So it actually expels really concentrated urine. And it also burrows down into the sand for months at a time. And this is a behavior of the Australian desert water holding frog. Similarly is the cute little spinifex hopping mouse, and it wraps its tail around its face to minimize loss of moisture. And it also enjoys burrowing down into the sand. So physiological mechanisms are, instead of choices, mechanisms that happen inherently. For example, camels. This was when I went riding on a camel recently. Camels are really cool creatures. They can store water in their humps, but the physiological mechanism of this is they can actually, by metabolizing fat in their humps, produce water. Water is still evaporated from their body because they live in really hot conditions. So they've actually adapted to having a very, very high solute concentration and are thus tolerant of these hot conditions. For freshwater fish, we have where the environment is fresh water. My question is, where, therefore, is it most salty? Is it outside of the fish in the water, or is it inside the fish? Well, in a freshwater environment, it's actually a saltier environment inside the fish. So naturally, where is water going to want to flow? It flows from where there is a low solute concentration to where there's a high solute concentration. So water will flow into the fish. They don't have to drink much water at all, as water just naturally will flow in through their gills, and it is absorbed through their skin. There is a lot of water coming in, and so therefore there is a lot of water coming out. They pass a lot of water, and therefore they have what's called like very diluted urine, as opposed to, say, a saltwater fish. And again, my question is, where is it more salty? Is it more salty outside in the salty water, or is it more salty inside the fish? Well, in a saltwater environment, it is more salty outside of the fish. So where is that water going to go? Easy way to remember it is water follows salt. So the water is going to flow from the fish to the outside environment. So what do they have to do? Their behavior, their choices, they have to drink lots of water to stay hydrated. And they don't want to lose much, so they excrete actually very, very concentrated salty urine. They also lose water through their skin and through their gills. Finally, we can talk about homeostatic mechanisms. So we have in mammals this hormone called ADH, and that stands for, as you can see up here, anti-diuretic hormone. And as the word kind of sounds like diuretic, diarrhea, that's like losing fluid. So anti that, it means it's this hormone that stops us from losing water. And it's released by the pituitary gland and is simply responsible for conserving water. This happens through a few steps. So remember the hypothalamus? We've spoken about this before. It's this little gland, and it monitors like a temperature. It also monitors the osmolarity, that's the solute concentration, again, of our blood. And when it picks up that there's a high solute concentration, so we're dehydrated, there's not much water compared to solutes, it sends a message to the pituitary gland to release ADH. The hormone is released where through the blood it is carried to the kidneys where it acts upon the nephron. It increases the permeability of the cells in the collecting ducts. So what that means is it's going to allow more water to pass through from the nephron back into the blood. So it increases the rate of reabsorption of water, thus minimizing the amount of water that is lost. So when our brain picks up that we're dehydrated, we release ADH. And so water is retained. And this is how animals and mammals maintain water balance through structural, behavioral, physiological, and homeostatic mechanisms. So let's have a look at plants now. Water balance in plants. Plants have adaptations as well that allow them to live in really dry conditions. We have different types of plants based on where they live. So xerophytes, for example, are plants that live in dry, harsh conditions. They have structural features to minimize water loss, including like they have thick, waxy cuticles on the leaf surface. They also have reduced number of stomata or sunken stomata, reduced number of leaves, and hairs on leaves to absorb more water. So let's focus on that. Let's talk about the waxy cuticle. It's this translucent, like see-through layer, which coats exposed areas of the leaves to the air. It coats it, restricting how much water can be evaporated from it. We also have controlled stomata. So remember, stomata are these pores that open and close, and it allows gas exchange to occur, but moisture can also be lost through the stomata. So they close at night when there's no light, because photosynthesis can't occur, so we don't need CO2 to be coming in and O2 to be coming out. Plants also have vacuoles, and vacuoles are these kind of spaces within them that they take up a lot of space, and they can swell up to 75 to 80% of a cell's volume, just allowing plants to store water. Xerophytes have leaves that are often really thin to reduce surface area, like needle leaves, or they can often have leaves that just curl. When they curl, they trap moist air, thus decreasing evaporation. Or evaporation in plants is called, starts with T, do you remember? Transpiration. The common wattle, the beautiful Australian wattle, is really resourceful in this way that it also like angles through the leaves and through the stems, water to drip down to the roots on the ground. Roots are really important in also minimizing water loss, but also obtaining water. So roots can either be shallow and horizontal. Think, why could that be? Wouldn't they want to go deep? Well, one way that they can get water is by absorbing it from the surface when it falls before it dehydrates. But then we also have roots that just go deep and absorb water from down deep in the ground. Like xerophytes, there are other categories of plants based on their environment and based on their water availability, we can group plants. So we have xerophytes, dry conditions. We have mesophytes. They live in areas of adequate water availability. They're the real common kind of plants. What about when there's heaps of water, like aquatic plants? Well, these ones, if they live in or on the water, they're called hydrophytes. so hydro meaning water. They don't need adaptations for water retention. Their biggest challenge is obtaining something else, and often that's air, sometimes even light, for photosynthesis. What about those plants you see at the beach? These are called halophytes, and they live in really salty conditions and often really dry conditions as well. So they have similar adaptations to the xerophytes that we spoke about. One main homeostatic mechanism that plants have in times of environmental stress, such as drought, when there's not much water, is they cause their stomata to close. This can come at a cost of photosynthesis, but they need to conserve water. So when guard cells surrounding the stomata lose water, do you remember we said they shrink and they collapse, and so they close that opening. There's also another factor at play here, and it's a hormone. It's called ABA, which is short for abscisic acid, and it's a key hormone involved in regulating stomata movement. So when a plant doesn't have much water, there's a deficiency in water availability, it responds by producing ABA, which also just assists in stimulating stomatal closure, and it can be for long periods of time. So this is how plants maintain water balance. And that is actually all for today. So for more information, jump on YouTube, check out some more videos, or especially jump into your textbook. It's chapter 13 where you can get into the key terms. Make sure you're adding key terms to the glossary. Be sure even to be jumping on these videos and watching over ones from previous topics, and especially coming up to exam and revision time. But I hope that this video has been helpful and informative, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Goodbye.